Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. I'm Shona Kohler. With me in the studio is Yarik Turianskyi of the South African Institute of International Affairs to discuss the adequacy of the recommendations that are emerging from the African peer review mechanism process. To date, 6 APRM reviews have been completed, and the resultant reports seem to adequately identify the governance challenges being faced by the countries reviewed. However, the recommendations proposed to deal with these challenges seem to fall short of offering workable solutions. Yarik, you've co-authored an opinion piece about the APRM recommendations, and one of the shortcomings that you seem to identify is that the recommendations are strong on emotional appeal and lacking in actionable substance. Can you explain a bit more about this?
Yeah, sure. My colleague Terence and Corrigan and I were both working on looking at the 6 available APRM reports. I was looking at them from the perspective of political and governance problems, and he was looking at them from the perspective of socioeconomic development. Now, while we were reading them very thoroughly and we were sharing the recommendations, we kept sharing these extremely vague recommendations with each other, and that's how the idea developed of actually writing an opinion piece and identifying at least one extremely vague recommendation in each one of the reports.
Okay, and can you give us some examples? What is one of these vague recommendations?
Well, by far my favorite one comes from the report of South Africa.
Okay.
The report of South Africa identifies that there's a problem with making MPs accountable, because they're not really accountable to the people who vote for them, the electorate, but rather they are accountable to the party, because they're on the party list. The report correctly identifies this as a problem, but its recommendation is, quote, it recommends that the South African government finds creative ways to make MPs accountable. Now, a recommendation like that is difficult to implement practically. And what is meant by creative ways? Does this mean we weren't able to find anything out, so, you know, here's the ball, it's in your court now?
Okay, and were there any similar recommendations you can identify in others of the report?
There's definitely a lot of strengthening involved. Strengthening capacity, especially when it comes to parliaments, probably could be identified across all 6 reports that we reviewed. Apart from that, fighting corruptions in vague terms. For example, the report on Ghana suggests that the government should, quote, engage holistically with the problem of corruption. Is there any other way?
Okay, so sort of lacking in policy guidance mechanisms, would you say?
Look, not all the recommendations are so vague. Some actually do tell you that you need to focus on this area, you know, instead of the other. Specifically, the reports of Algeria and Benin actually provide an outline how some problems could be tackled. But those are also not immune from the vagueness. For example, the report on Benin states that the government should allow the youth to exercise their political rights and participate in governance.
When the APRM was conceptualized, was it expected that the recommendations would be more concrete?
Definitely.
Definitely.
Yes.
Okay, so do you have suggestions on how these recommendations can be strengthened?
My colleague and I basically came up with 2 ways that these recommendations could be improved. First of all, the APRM already has a way of dealing with them. It's got the APR forum, and it's got the heads of states forum, where the heads of state basically get together to review a country once the report has been completed. Now, those recommendations could be strengthened by discussion amongst peers. For example, someone from Ghana can say, you know, we had problems with corruption, you know, to someone in Kenya, and this is how we've dealt with them. So instead of saying, let's engage holistically with corruption, this is precisely the outline of how we dealt with them. And through a political discussion between the heads of state, we can move forward and come up with practical recommendations as opposed to vague ones. That would be solution number 1. Solution number 2 would be to call for papers. Get civil society, get non-governmental organizations, businesses, citizens, academia especially, together and say, this is the problem, how do we deal with it? Brainstorm, you know, have a workshop for a day or 2 and see what solutions can be proposed.
Do you expect that these solutions will be pursued?
Probably not.
Okay.
We do express hope that the APR heads of state forum will pay more attention to these problems, because so far the peer reviews, which is supposed to be crux of the entire peer review mechanism, have been somewhat lacking, being between 2 and 4 hours. We think that much more time needs to be spent, especially on discussing these problems and recommendations to them.
Do you think that a failure to strengthen these recommendations will ultimately result in a failure of the APRM process?
Possibly. If a recommendation is vague to begin with and there's no way to implement it practically, then we fail, because the APRM has succeeded in identifying the problem but then has failed in proposing a solution to it. So we know the problem, and that's step one, that's good. But unless we can remedy the problem or find some sort of a solution to it, then we're still back to square one, just with more knowledge.
Thank you, Yarik. That was Yarik Turianskyi of the South African Institute of International Affairs, speaking to Polity about the recommendations emerging from the African peer review mechanism process and the need to strengthen these recommendations if they are to be effective.